Commander Vextar felt the cold metal of Station Alpha 7 beneath his feet as he stepped off the transport vessel. The artificial gravity was slightly lighter than what he was used to, but after fighting battles on over 200 different worlds, his body adapted instantly. His 4 arms moved with practiced precision as he adjusted his ceremonial armor, each piece marking another victory from his 1,000 battles across the galaxy. The scars covering his arms told stories that most beings could only imagine. The deep groove along his upper left arm came from a Corvani blade during the siege of Talvora. The twisted mark on his right shoulder was a gift from Zelthian acid cannons at the Battle of 7 Moons. Each mark was a badge of honor, proof that he had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. As the Galactic Defense Coalition's most experienced military analyst, Vextar had seen every kind of warrior the universe had to offer. He had evaluated the bone-crushing Brutari, whose entire culture revolved around physical dominance. He had studied the cold, calculating Nethics, who treated warfare like a chess game played with living pieces. The proud Valorians considered battle an art form, while the savage Draktar viewed it as pure survival. Each species followed predictable patterns, making his job straightforward. Today was different. Today he was here to judge humanity. Walking through the station's corridors, Vextar noticed the strange architecture. Most galactic stations were built for efficiency, straight lines, minimal decoration, everything designed for maximum function. This human-built section had curves and colors that served no tactical purpose. Plants grew in small alcoves, their green leaves rustling in the recycled air. It seemed almost wasteful, yet oddly peaceful. The main conference hall was larger than necessary, with a long table that could seat dozens. Most species preferred smaller, more intimidating meeting spaces. The humans had chosen something that felt almost welcoming. Soft lighting cast gentle shadows, and the air carried a faint scent of something Vextar's translator couldn't identify, something organic and pleasant. 3 humans waited for him. The first was clearly their leader, a man with graying hair and kind eyes. His clothes were simple but well-made, without the elaborate displays of rank that most species preferred. When he stepped forward, his movement was confident but not aggressive. Tom Bradley extended his hand, that peculiar human gesture Vextar had studied in preparation for this meeting. The handshake was supposed to demonstrate that neither party carried weapons, though in an age of energy shields and plasma cannons, the gesture seemed purely ceremonial. Still, there was something genuine about the way the human offered it. Standing beside Tom was Captain Lisa Martinez, their military representative. Vextar's trained eye immediately recognized her as a true warrior. She carried herself with the balanced stance of someone who had seen real combat, her eyes constantly scanning the room in a way that spoke of ingrained tactical awareness. Yet she seemed relaxed, comfortable in her own skin in a way that many battle-hardened veterans never achieved. The third human introduced himself as Dr. James Peterson, their historical advisor. He was older than the others, with silver hair and hands that showed the calluses of someone who worked with ancient documents and data cores. His presence suggested the humans took their military history seriously enough to bring their best scholar. When Tom spoke, his voice was warm and genuine. The translator in Vextar's ear converted the words, but it couldn't capture the subtle emotions underneath. There was respect there, certainly, but also something else, a kind of quiet confidence that Vextar found intriguing. Most species reacted to his presence in predictable ways. The aggressive ones would puff themselves up, trying to match his intimidating appearance with displays of their own strength. The diplomatic ones would shower him with elaborate compliments and gifts, hoping to buy favorable treatment. The fearful ones would stammer and bow, making it clear they considered themselves inferior. These humans did none of those things. They treated him with respect, certainly, but as an equal rather than a superior or a threat. It was refreshing and slightly puzzling. When Vextar mentioned reviewing their preliminary files, he watched their reactions carefully. Most species would either boast about their greatest victories or try to downplay their military history, depending on their strategy. Lisa's response was matter-of-fact, almost casual. That word, disagreements, stuck in Vextar's mind as they moved toward the archives. In his experience, species described their conflicts in ways that revealed their military philosophy. The Corvani spoke of glorious conquests. The Nethics referred to calculated eliminations. The Drakdars simply called them hunts. But disagreements? That suggested something entirely different. It implied that humans viewed their wars not as natural expressions of dominance or survival, but as unfortunate conflicts between parties who might otherwise coexist peacefully. It was a perspective Vextar had never encountered before, and it made him genuinely curious about what he would discover in their military archives. As they walked through the station's corridors toward the historical database, Vextar found himself wondering if these humans might actually surprise him. In his 1,000 battles, he had learned that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who didn't fit the expected patterns. The morning light filtered through the station's artificial windows as Vextar made his way to the human historical archives. His 4 arms moved restlessly at his sides, a nervous habit he'd developed over centuries of warfare. Something about yesterday's conversation had left him unsettled. The casual way these humans spoke about their conflicts didn't match anything in his extensive experience. Dr. Robert Chen met him at the entrance to the archives, a man whose weathered face spoke of years spent buried in historical documents. His assistant, Jennifer Walsh, stood nearby with the kind of quiet competence that Vextar associated with seasoned intelligence officers. Both humans carried themselves with an easy confidence that he was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. The archive chamber itself was breathtaking. Thousands upon thousands of data cores lined the walls, each one pulsing with a soft blue light that indicated active storage. The sheer volume of recorded information was staggering. Most species kept military records for practical purposes, tactical analysis, strategic planning, learning from victories and defeats. But this felt different. This felt like a species that was genuinely trying to understand itself. Robert's fingers moved across the holographic interface with practiced ease, calling up filing systems that stretched back thousands of years. The organization was complex, with cross-references and interconnected databases that suggested layers of analysis Vextar hadn't expected from what he'd assumed was a relatively young civilization. When Vextar requested their greatest victories, he expected the usual display. Most species would immediately pull up their most decisive conquests, the battles where they'd crushed their enemies so completely that entire civilizations had surrendered. The Corvani loved showing their complete destruction of the Pythic homeworld. The Nethics took pride in their systematic elimination of the Veltar rebellion. Clean, decisive, final. But Robert hesitated, and that hesitation spoke volumes. Jennifer stepped closer to the display, her expression thoughtful rather than proud. They weren't thinking about victories in terms of enemies destroyed or territory claimed. They were thinking about something else entirely. The first hologram that materialized showed a global conflict of unprecedented scale. World War II, they called it. Vextar's combat analyzer immediately began processing the data, troop movements, casualty figures, resource allocation. But as the information flowed, his understanding of what he was seeing became increasingly confused. This wasn't one nation conquering others. This wasn't even a traditional alliance of convenience where multiple species banded together against a common threat for mutual benefit. This was something that defied every military principle he'd learned across 500 years of studying warfare. Multiple human nations had joined together, not to gain territory or resources, but to fight against an idea. An ideology. They'd spent enormous amounts of blood and treasure, sacrificed millions of their own people, to stop other humans from implementing a particular way of thinking about society and governance. The tactical readouts made no sense. Human soldiers from completely different continents, speaking different languages, following different cultural traditions, had fought and died alongside each other. Americans had died defending British positions. Australians had sacrificed themselves for Soviet objectives. French resistance fighters had coordinated with Polish commandos they'd never met. But what truly broke Vextar's understanding was the realization that these weren't different species forming an alliance. These were all the same people, genetically identical humans, choosing to kill other genetically identical humans based on abstract philosophical differences. Jennifer's matter-of-fact explanation only made it worse. This wasn't an aberration in human history. This was normal. Humans regularly turned weapons against their own genetic relatives over ideas about how society should be organized, how people should be treated, what constituted justice or freedom or proper governance. The concept violated everything Vextar understood about biological imperatives. Every species he'd studied followed predictable patterns based on genetic loyalty. Families protected families. Communities protected communities. Species protected species. You might have territorial disputes or resource conflicts, but you didn't wage total war against your own genetic line over abstract concepts. As more files loaded, Vextar saw the pattern repeating throughout human history. Civil wars where brothers literally fought brothers. Revolutionary conflicts where children took up arms against their parents' generation. Independence movements where genetically identical populations slaughtered each other over political philosophy. But then Jennifer showed him something even more confusing. In that same global war, human soldiers had risked their lives to protect other humans they'd never met, people from different continents, different cultures, different backgrounds. American soldiers had died defending Jewish families they'd never spoken to. British pilots had sacrificed themselves to protect Soviet supply lines. Australian medics had treated wounded German prisoners with the same care they gave their own wounded. The contradiction was staggering. Humans would kill their own relatives over political differences, but would also die protecting complete strangers based on abstract principles of human dignity and justice. They seemed capable of both ultimate tribal loyalty and complete transcendence of tribal thinking, sometimes simultaneously. Robert pulled up more files, showing conflicts where humans fought for the freedom of people they considered inferior by their own cultural standards. Wars where economically advantaged groups sacrificed their wealth and comfort to ensure better treatment for economically disadvantaged populations. Battles where humans died not to gain anything for themselves, but to ensure that other humans they'd never meet might live with greater dignity and freedom. Vextar's 3 hearts were beating in an irregular pattern as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. His combat analyzer kept throwing error messages as it attempted to categorize motivations and predict strategic outcomes based on traditional military logic. These humans fought wars that made no tactical sense, for reasons that provided no evolutionary advantage, against enemies who were genetically identical to themselves, while simultaneously protecting strangers based on shared abstract values that transcended genetic, cultural, and economic boundaries. It was the most terrifying and magnificent thing he'd ever encountered. The third day in the archives found Vextar staring at his notes with growing bewilderment. Sleep had become difficult, his mind kept churning through the impossible contradictions he'd discovered in human warfare. Every military principle he'd learned across centuries of combat seemed to crumble when applied to human conflicts. Kevin Thompson arrived that morning carrying additional data cores, his young face bright with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved historical research. Unlike most military analysts Vextar had worked with, Kevin seemed to find joy in the complexities rather than frustration with the contradictions. The holographic display showed footage from something called the American Civil War, and Vextar found himself watching scenes that his combat-trained mind simply couldn't process logically. Here was a conflict where families literally split apart, fathers disowning sons, brothers choosing opposite sides, lifelong friends becoming mortal enemies. All over the question of whether one group of humans should be allowed to own another group of humans as property. What struck Vextar most forcefully was that this wasn't a resource war or a territorial dispute. The humans fighting to end slavery gained nothing material from victory. In fact, they lost enormous amounts of wealth, resources, and economic advantage. They chose to impoverish themselves and sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives for an abstract principle about human dignity and freedom. Kevin noticed Vextar's confusion and pulled up additional files. His fingers moved quickly through the database, calling up accounts that he clearly found fascinating rather than disturbing. The young researcher's excitement was infectious, even as the content became more bewildering. The stories that emerged defied every rule of warfare Vexstar had learned. During World War II, there were documented cases of soldiers sharing their limited food rations with captured enemies. Not as part of some strategic psychological operation, but simply because they felt it was the right thing to do. American GIs giving chocolate bars to German prisoners. British soldiers sharing cigarettes with captured Italians. Soviet troops providing medical care to wounded fascists who had been trying to kill them hours earlier. Vexstar's 3 hearts began beating irregularly as he processed this information. In every galactic conflict he'd studied, captured enemies were either executed immediately to prevent escape, or enslaved to provide labor for the victorious side. The concept of using precious resources to keep enemies healthy and comfortable was not just foreign, it was actively counterproductive from a military standpoint. Dr. Amy Rodriguez, the chief archivist, joined their discussion carrying files that she seemed to handle with particular care. Her weathered hands moved gently across the data interfaces, calling up medical records and battlefield reports that painted an even stranger picture of human warfare. The documentation showed field medics, trained soldiers whose primary job was healing rather than killing, rushing into active combat zones to treat wounded enemies. These weren't rear-echelon personnel working in safe field hospitals. These were combat medics crawling through gunfire and artillery bombardments to provide medical aid to people who had been actively trying to kill them moments before. Amy explained something called the Hippocratic Oath, a promise that human medical personnel made to treat all injured people regardless of which side they fought for. The concept was so alien to Vexstar's understanding that his translator seemed to struggle with the philosophical implications. The medical records showed human doctors performing complex surgeries on enemy soldiers while their own wounded waited for treatment. Combat medics sharing morphine and bandages with captured enemies. Field hospitals treating prisoners alongside their own forces, using the same equipment, the same medicines, the same level of care. But what truly shattered Vexstar's understanding was discovering that this wasn't just official policy, it was a deeply held cultural value that individual humans embraced even when it put them at tactical disadvantage. There were accounts of medics being killed while treating enemy wounded, of doctors being captured because they refused to abandon injured prisoners, of entire medical units being overrun because they wouldn't retreat while enemy casualties needed care. Kevin showed him footage of a battlefield medic during the Vietnam conflict, crawling through sniper fire to reach a wounded enemy soldier. The medic could have easily killed the enemy, claimed a victory, and moved to safety. Instead, he spent 20 minutes under fire applying tourniquets and administering pain medication to someone who had been shooting at his friends. The contradiction was staggering. Humans had developed weapons of incredible destructive power, bombs that could level entire cities, chemical weapons that could kill thousands, biological agents that could wipe out entire populations. They were clearly capable of ultimate violence and total war. But they simultaneously developed ethical codes that limited their own effectiveness in combat, rules that put enemy welfare above tactical advantage. Amy pulled up more files showing human prisoner-of-war camps. Instead of the slave labor facilities or execution centers that most species used for captured enemies, humans built elaborate facilities designed to keep prisoners healthy, educated, and entertained. They provided food, medical care, recreational activities, and even educational opportunities to people who had been trying to destroy them. The resource expenditure was enormous. Humans diverted significant portions of their wartime production to caring for enemy prisoners who contributed nothing to their war effort and who would likely return to combat against them if freed. From any logical military perspective, it was madness. But as Vexstar studied more examples, he began to see a pattern that his analytical mind couldn't quite categorize. Human warfare seemed to operate on 2 completely different levels simultaneously. On one level, they were capable of devastating efficiency and ruthless tactical thinking. On another level, they imposed ethical constraints on themselves that made victory more difficult but preserved something they seemed to value even more than victory itself. The files showed human soldiers who refused to follow orders that violated their personal moral codes, even when that refusal meant court-martial or execution. Pilots who risked their lives to avoid civilian casualties when bombing military targets would have been more effective. Ground troops who shared their supplies with starving enemy civilians in occupied territories. As the day wore on and more examples accumulated, Vextar realized he was looking at a species that had somehow developed the ability to simultaneously embrace and transcend their own warrior nature. They could be as ruthless as any predator when necessary, but they could also choose mercy in situations where mercy made no tactical sense. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever encountered in his 1,000 battles across the galaxy. Vextar's final day in the human archives began with what he thought would be routine cleanup work. Colonel Mike Davis had prepared a collection of what he casually referred to as minor historical footnotes, small incidents that hadn't shaped the course of major wars but were preserved for their cultural significance. After days of studying massive conflicts involving millions of casualties, Vextar expected these smaller events to be straightforward military skirmishes. The colonel was a veteran himself, with the kind of steady presence that came from years of command experience. His uniform was immaculate but worn in places that suggested real field service rather than ceremonial duties. When he spoke about military history, there was a personal quality to his voice that made Vextar suspect he'd lived through some of the more recent conflicts himself. As Mike scrolled through the files, Vextar noticed that these minor events were categorized differently than the major battles he'd been studying. Instead of being filed by strategic importance or casualty counts, they were organized by what humans seemed to consider their moral or cultural significance. It was yet another example of the peculiar way humans thought about warfare. One file caught Vextar's attention immediately, the Christmas Truce of 1914. The date placed it during what humans called World War I, one of their most devastating conflicts. Vextar expected to see some tactical maneuver or minor skirmish that had been preserved for training purposes. What appeared on the holographic display defied every military principle Vextar had ever learned. The setting was the Western Front, where human armies had been locked in brutal trench warfare for months. The conditions were horrific, soldiers living in mud-filled trenches, surrounded by barbed wire, constantly under threat of sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and poison gas attacks. The casualty rates were staggering, with thousands dying daily for advances measured in yards. But on December 24, 1914, something unprecedented happened. The display showed grainy footage and photographs of soldiers climbing out of their trenches, not to attack, but to meet in the middle of no man's land. German troops singing Christmas carols were answered by British soldiers singing the same songs in their own language. French poilus and German Lancer exchanged cigarettes and chocolate. Enemies who had been trying to kill each other for months were suddenly sharing food, showing photographs of their families, even playing impromptu games of football with makeshift balls. Vextar stared at the images in complete disbelief. His combat analyzer, a sophisticated implant that had processed tactical data from thousands of battles across the galaxy, began throwing error messages. The logical circuits simply couldn't compute what he was seeing. Colonel Davis noticed Vextar's confusion and activated additional files. The documentation showed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Along hundreds of miles of front lines, similar scenes were playing out simultaneously. Soldiers who spoke different languages, followed different flags, and had been indoctrinated to hate each other were spontaneously choosing peace. Amanda Wright, the cultural liaison, had joined them for this final session. Her voice was soft but filled with emotion as she explained what made this event so significant to human culture. These weren't orders from commanding officers. This wasn't a negotiated ceasefire or a strategic pause in fighting. This was individual soldiers, acting on their own initiative, choosing to remember their shared humanity in the middle of mechanized slaughter. The tactical implications were staggering. Both sides had given up enormous strategic advantages. They'd revealed their positions, their troop strengths, the conditions of their fortifications. They'd allowed enemy soldiers to examine their weapons and defenses up close. Any competent military analyst would have used such opportunities to gather intelligence for devastating attacks. Instead, they'd used the time to sing songs and share stories about their homes. Vextar's voice was hoarse when he finally managed to speak. The concept was so alien to his understanding that his translator seemed to struggle with the emotional undertones. In his 1,000 battles, he'd seen temporary ceasefires for tactical reasons, to recover wounded, to resupply, to reposition forces. But this wasn't tactical. This was soldiers on both sides simultaneously deciding that their shared celebration of peace was more important than military advantage. Amanda explained that Christmas held special significance in human culture as a celebration of peace, hope, and goodwill toward all people. But what made the truce remarkable wasn't the religious aspect, it was that soldiers from different nations, different cultures, and different military traditions all recognized something universal in that message. Colonel Davis showed him more documentation. Letters from soldiers describing the experience, photographs of enemies playing games together, accounts of men who had been shooting at each other for months discovering they had children the same age, homes in similar small towns, shared dreams of returning to peaceful lives. But what truly shattered Vextar's worldview was learning what happened afterward. The next day, December 26th, most of these same soldiers returned to their trenches and resumed trying to kill each other. The war continued with the same intensity, the same casualties, the same brutal efficiency. Some soldiers refused to fight and faced court-martial or execution for their decision. But the majority understood that their moment of shared humanity existed in a separate space from their duty to their nations and their commitment to their military objectives. They had experienced perfect peace and perfect war simultaneously, holding both realities in their minds without letting either diminish the other. They could share chocolate with an enemy on Christmas Eve and shoot at the same person on December 26th, not because they were callous or cruel, but because they understood that warfare and humanity operated on different levels of existence. Vextar felt something he had never experienced in his centuries of military service, his fundamental understanding of reality was collapsing. His combat analyzer finally shut down completely, unable to process tactical scenarios where enemies voluntarily abandoned strategic advantages to share moments of joy with people they would resume trying to kill the next day. For the first time in his 1,000 battles, Commander Vextar realized that his vast military experience had taught him nothing about the most important aspects of warfare, the reasons why thinking beings choose to fight, and the values they preserve even in the midst of ultimate violence. These humans had found a way to remain human even while being warriors. The Great Council chamber of the Galactic Defense Coalition buzzed with anticipation as military leaders from across the galaxy gathered for Vextar's final assessment. The room itself was a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the wildly different physiologies of 12 distinct species. Atmospheric processors maintained separate environmental zones, while universal translators ensured that every word would be understood regardless of the speaker's origin. General Krothvalm of the Corvani Empire sat in his reinforced chair, his massive frame covered in ceremonial battle armor that gleamed under the chamber's lights. His species valued strength above all else, and his presence here represented centuries of military dominance through sheer physical superiority. Beside him, the ethereal form of Commander Zilneth flickered as her energy-based species maintained cohesion in the chamber's gravity well. Admiral Thexkar of the Brutari Federation tapped his claws impatiently against his armrest. His people had built their reputation on overwhelming force and rapid conquest, and he clearly expected this evaluation to follow familiar patterns. The cold, calculating gaze of strategic analyst Velthorn suggested that the Nethix Collective was already running probability calculations on humanity's potential military contributions. At the center of it all, Admiral Jane Foster sat with remarkable composure. Her simple blue uniform stood out among the elaborate ceremonial dress of the other military leaders, but her calm confidence commanded respect. She had arrived at the station 3 days earlier, and Vextar had observed her interactions with the various alien dignitaries. Unlike most species representatives, who either postured aggressively or seemed intimidated by the galactic powers, she treated everyone with the same respectful professionalism. As Vextar approached the podium, he felt the weight of his reputation and the expectations of the assembled leaders. His 1,000 victories had earned him a place as the Coalition's most trusted military analyst. Species across the galaxy accepted his recommendations without question, knowing that his assessments had never led them astray. But today was different. Today he was about to challenge everything these military leaders thought they understood about warfare. The chamber fell silent as his 4 arms moved to activate the speaking platform. The universal translators hummed to life, preparing to carry his words to minds that processed information in ways radically different from his own. Some of these beings communicated through pheromones, others through electromagnetic fields, but all would understand the gravity of what he was about to say. His voice carried across the chamber with the authority that came from centuries of combat experience. Every leader present had read his service record, had studied his tactical analyses, had benefited from his strategic insights. They trusted his judgment because he understood warfare in ways that transcended species differences. The opening of his speech was familiar territory, the logical framework that had guided his assessments for over 300 evaluations. Species fought for predictable reasons, followed understandable patterns, made decisions based on evolutionary imperatives and resource requirements. His analysis had always been straightforward because military behavior, regardless of the species involved, followed certain universal principles. But as he continued speaking, Vextar could see confusion beginning to ripple through the assembled leaders. General Krothvom's massive head tilted slightly, his small eyes narrowing as he tried to process the implications of what he was hearing. The Corvani concept of honor was based on personal combat prowess and the accumulation of victories. The idea of fighting for abstract principles that provided no material benefit was genuinely incomprehensible. Commander Zilnetha's energy form flickered more rapidly as her species' collective consciousness struggled to understand individual humans making moral choices that contradicted their group's immediate interests. Her people made decisions through consensus and logical analysis of outcomes. The concept of soldiers acting against orders based on personal ethical convictions was as alien to her as breathing underwater. Admiral Thexkar's claws stopped tapping as Vextar described human mercy toward enemies. The Brutari had built their military doctrine around the principle that defeated enemies should be eliminated quickly to prevent future threats. The idea of using resources to keep enemy prisoners healthy and comfortable violated every strategic principle his species had developed over millennia of warfare. But it was strategic analyst Velthorn whose reaction was most pronounced. The Nethix collective prided itself on perfectly logical military planning, with every decision calculated for maximum strategic advantage. As Vextar described humans choosing honor over victory, principle over survival, the analyst's normally impassive features showed genuine distress. His species' entire worldview was based on the premise that intelligent beings would always choose the most logically advantageous course of action. General David Mitchell, attending virtually from Earth, remained perfectly still throughout the presentation. His weathered face showed no emotion as Vextar described the contradictions that had shattered his understanding of warfare. Unlike the alien leaders, who seemed increasingly agitated by the implications, the human general appeared unsurprised by the assessment. As Vextar moved toward his conclusion, he could feel the tension in the chamber reaching a breaking point. Several of the assembled leaders were exchanging glances, clearly uncertain how to process an evaluation that challenged their fundamental assumptions about military behavior. The final moments of his speech carried a weight that surprised even Vextar himself. His recommendation wasn't based on the usual metrics, technological superiority, numerical advantages, strategic resources, or tactical innovations. Instead, he was asking the coalition to accept a species because they fought for reasons that transcended immediate tactical concerns. Admiral Foster's slight smile as the vote was called seemed to acknowledge something that the other leaders were still struggling to understand. She had known from the beginning that humanity's strength lay not in their weapons or their numbers, but in their ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to be both warriors and peacemakers, enemies and friends, pragmatists and idealists. The unanimous vote that followed wasn't just an acceptance of humanity into the coalition. It was an acknowledgement that the galaxy's understanding of warfare itself might need to evolve to accommodate a species that had found ways to remain human even in the midst of ultimate violence. As the session ended and the various leaders began filing out of the chamber, Vextar realized that his 1,000 battles had taught him to recognize military capability, but these humans had taught him something far more valuable. They had shown him what military capability should be used to protect.